Here's the second issue with Christian nationalism. In my first video, I said that there were ideas throughout history where people have thought in terms of what we might call Christian nationhood. And I would have issues with some of them, but they are probably not the major problem. Now, one of the things I've observed is that when people are arguing about Christian nationalism, they want to tell us that all they are doing is following in that historic tradition. But actually, we are seeing something very different. In fact, I would say quite strongly that if a Puritan was to turn up today, or an evangelical from the Great Awakening was to turn up today, in fact, lots of people from history were to turn up today, that they wouldn't recognise what is being presented as this single Christian nationalism as anything closely resembling what they were about. Because we're seeing something very different here. What we are seeing is actually that there is this thing called nationalism, and we are seeing people take that thing and slap the label Christian onto it, basically to christen it, to baptise it, and to make it okay. And we saw a good example of this with events through the summer here in the United Kingdom. I'm speaking in at the end of September 2025, just to locate this if you watch this at a much later date, where we had something called the Unite the Kingdom rally. And that was a rally that was very clearly about nationalism, about identifying as British and protecting this British culture and ethnicity and that kind of thing from perceived attack in a way that went beyond patriotism. I will come back to that later. But at this rally, like a guy called Tommy Robinson, long associated with what we tend to refer to as the far right, and we'll talk about terms like that a bit later on. Former BNP member, founder of the EDL, the English Defence League, all that kind of history. And at that rally, with the waving of Union Jacks and also St George's crosses, there might have been some Scottish salters and Welsh dragons and Northern Irish flags amongst them as well. I don't know if they had any Black Country or Yorkshire flags, I don't know, or Lancashire roses. But at that rally, with all of those flags, and that promotion of Englishness and Britishness, were Christians who were basically arguing that all of that stuff, all the concerns and fears that people had were true and right, and that the answer did lie in this nationalism bit, but it needed to be Christian nationalism because it needed Christ as the king over it all. And at one level, that doesn't sound too bad, does it? They are emphasising Christ. They're saying you need the gospel, you need to trust in Jesus. Even to say you need trust in Jesus for the forgiveness of sin. But what we lacked was an engagement with the actual idolatry of nationalism. And now, look, I know that if you were to look at a parade, even a parade that is a minority, and therefore potentially is drawing the most passionate and dedicated devotees, that you might have a lot of people that aren't necessarily there because they fully get the potential agenda and ideology behind it, that they've been attracted to some of the specific grievances that have been listed. But at the core of that rally was this thing called nationalism, and Christianity and Jesus were being tagged onto it. A little side point here, just in religious terms. I think there might be a temptation for some to say it couldn't be idolatrous, it couldn't be a different gospel because Jesus was proclaimed. But actually what we've seen throughout history, that often there are religious identities and idolatrous approaches that are syncretistic. In fact, most idolatries are. If we don't see that kind of syncretism, if we see an exclusivism around some of the monotheistic religions that we see, like Islam particularly, where they wouldn't allow for that just to tag some other deity on. That's because they are monotheistic, and it's because they have grown out of Christianity. But most religions are really synchronistic because they allow you to add gods in. That's why Paul in Athens will find lots of idols, but he will also find an altar to the unknown God. And for the Athenians, that meant they could just tag on other gods just in case. But for Paul, he has to say that's the one true God. And that means that all your other idols, all your other gods are false. They are by definition idols. Now, let me come back to this question of nationalism and what we're talking about here. Like I said, there is something that we would, I think, refer to as good and healthy, a love for your country. It's where your close identities are, that loyalty to a country that is a good thing, part of God's common grace. And patriotism basically doesn't mean my country right and wrong, and even less so, my country is always right. It means I love my country, and that means that I'm also prepared to challenge and see where there are things wrong, because I seek the well-being of those around me. It is possible to be patriotic without expecting certain things of your country. I can be patriotic knowing that the England football team is going to fall dismally in football and rugby, and quite often cricket as well. They don't have to win and be superior at everything. Even more important if you're from Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, I would suggest. I hope my brothers and sisters from the other home nations will let me off that. You can be patriotic without feeling that your country has to be a superpower. And that's important for the differences in the United Kingdom, as we see our nation losing its standing in the world over time, slipping down the economic league tables, losing that power and influence as in military terms as the US and Russia and China overtake. We don't need to compete with France on that. That's important for those wanting to make sense of the MAGA, Make America Great again, moving. So it's possible to be patriotic, love your flag, love your country, love its culture, all those kinds of things, cheer your sports teams on, care when things go wrong, grieve when there is suffering, rejoice when there are happy and joyful and good things. It's possible for all those things to be the case. But nationalism takes us to a different level. Nationalism is essentially saying that we go further than that. That the nation and its identity have to be preserved and protected at all costs. That is the one thing that matters. And so what we have seen develop is what I would refer to. So some people have talked about ethno-nationalism, where the emphasis is on the linking up of the nation and its identity with ethnicity. England is for the English, Scotland for the Scots, France for the French, America for some reason, the United States not for the Native Americans, but we'll worry about that later. So it becomes about protecting an ethnic identity. But it is also about protecting a cultural identity. That a nation is defined by its culture and its history. And that's important because one of the things that we are seeing is that people are saying we want to protect things that Christians would say, yes, we want to protect them, that are identified as Christian, even the Christian identity of this nation, not out of a belief in Christianity, but in a belief that that is our culture, that is what defines us. And then specific things that are identified with Christianity and Christian values are made the primary things. And what you will also realise is that other things that are also about being Christians are relegated much lower down the list. So ethno-cultural nationalism takes a nation and says, this is the thing that matters. This is the thing that has got to be protected and preserved at all costs. And what we have seen throughout history, sometimes very overtly, when you look at what happened in Italy and Germany in the late 1930s and into the 1940s, other examples around the world, what we have seen is that this often goes further. That one nation is seen as superior. So it's not that nations have to be preserved and protected, but specific nations and specific ethnicities and specific cultures have to be protected at all costs. Again, think about how this ethno-cultural nationalism has nothing to say about Native American, Maori, or Aboriginal culture and identity. And so it has been sadly combined with what we might refer to as white or Caucasian supremacy. What that also means is that it is possible, and we've seen this throughout history with particular political movements, it is possible for people from other ethnic groups to be included within the movement and even think that they are part of it, that they have a voice in it. And what you then see is that voice is permitted, providing those people recognise their place geographically, and so what you will see is that at various times in 20th century British political history, there was an attempt to encourage repatriation of non-whites, non-indigenous British people. And sometimes that's where it gets co-opted with other nationalisms, because what you will see is that there will be people who said, yes, we want to, from Afro-Caribbean and African context, who say, yes, we want to encourage a back to Africa movement, if you like. I guess it's why it is possible to see that some that have been even on the anti-Semitic wing of things have said that they have expressed a kind of support for the idea of Zionism. That doesn't mean that Zionism is a fascist idea. It simply means that some would have seen, yep, that actually that fits fine with what we're about, as long as the Jews know their place. So geographical place, that's where you belong within your God-defined boundaries, and a hierarchical place where you sit in relation to us, a recognition that white, Western, Anglo-Saxon, British and American culture is superior. That you have to find your place in that world order. But still that sense that somebody has supremacy. And what that will mean is that sometimes that cultural, political, ethno-supremacy is displayed by acts of force, and so we see that. So Vladimir Putin is a nationalist, a Russian nationalist, and his concern is for Russia to get regional power, and to do that by force. But there may be other ways that you're able to exercise that influence without using military force, providing your status is recognised, your culture and your ethnicity not just is protected in terms of its existence, but in terms of its position. And that's where you start to see it meet concerns and questions and challenges and frustrations, because it then becomes a specific reason for exercising things like immigration control, to decide that a country is full, to decide that the culture is at risk of being overwhelmed, and so to then demonise asylum seekers and other immigrants. And that's the kind of thing that we have been seeing. What it also means is that when people take the stage and start to say things that sound Christian, you realise that their reasoning is actually very different to Christian reasoning. So let me give you another example. At the United Kingdom rally, there was one guy, I think he was from New Zealand, and he made a big speech where he said that our nations need to be Christian. That's our heritage, that's our culture, that's our identity, that needs to be protected as supreme. And the way that we need to do that is to ban mosques and temples and gurdwaras, and to ban hijabs and presumably turbans and those kinds of things, any public, any visible representation of worship. Back to what I said in the previous video, people have been quick to say, but to defend that and say, but in the the Torah, and in the prophets, you see this need for Israel to be pure and to remove these other idolatrous religions from them, and that's all that is being said here. But what you realise is this, that the concern to ban those things comes not out of a concern for the hearts of people, not to see Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs come into Christ's kingdom and to know him as Lord and Saviour, for their hearts to be changed, just as we've experienced. And what it doesn't do is it doesn't recognise that all of the other expressions, the secular expressions of hope and faith and worship, from our football stadiums to our pop stars, all of those things are just as much external representations of a heart problem. It identifies these things as problems because they are other, they are different, they are from outside the nation. They are ethno-cultural problems. And so by banning them, you protect the field, the visible, the identity, the ethno-cultural national identity. You protect that. But we know full well that is not actually going to change the hearts of anybody. And in fact, it may encourage a greater resistance to the gospel. So we see something directly harmful for the work of the gospel declared in the interests of this nationalism. And I hope you're beginning to get a feel for why that is a problem, why you can't just simply stick Christ on the top of it or add Christ to that, no more than you could include an image of the baby Jesus and the Virgin Mary in a pagan temple and say we've turned Baal worship into Christian Baal worship, for example. It's just not doable. The Philistines thought that they could co-opt Israel's God into their worship by taking the Ark of the Covenant into Dagon's temple. And of course Dagon had to bow before Yahweh. So this nationalism is not something that we can simply co-opt. Now, I said I'd talk a little bit about the far right and fascism. I think we've tended to identify political expressions with this concept of the far right. I think that comes from the way in which particularly you saw fascism and the Nazi Party reacting and resisting, and that sort of historic resistance to communism, which is perceived as left-wing. I think there are issues. I sometimes use the label because I think people understand it better than a lot of other labels. Ethno-cultural nationalism is probably not going to catch on, is it, as a term? It's not something that you're going to chant at rallies if you are protesting these things. But there are challenges with that term because we have a political spectrum. I'm talking specifically here about the United Kingdom, but this would reflect with other countries. So you have left and right, and the left has primarily been identified with economic views. So specifically socialism. And you tend to get a centre ground, the idea of mixed economies, and that progresses into what is in fact economic liberalism on the right. The left has been concerned more about a kind of collectivism, and the right with a concern for nationhood, but also a concern for individual freedoms as well. So you see that politically at work, and then you see that overlaid onto that has been a kind of social liberalism that seems to have identified historically more with the left, though that is changing, and a social conservatism that has identified more with the right. And you will see some on the centre right that have concerns around things like immigration, because they've got concerns for things like law and order and defence and that kind of things, and they see that as a risk. But you also see people on the right that have less of a concern about that, because they see that if you care about things like free markets, you're going to want free movement of trade, free movement of goods and services, and you probably can't have that without free movement of people, for example. So those are the complexities of left and right. And you can see the spectrum, and you can see how people can move and shift on that. But in fact, what we tend to see with the far right, and indeed with the far left, is actually that there is a different spectrum. Meaning that sometimes those on the far right have more in common with those on the far left. It's a different way of thinking, it's a different way of approaching the world. In fact, I would sum it up as this. It is the belief that there are a small group of powerful people controlling everything, and they are the enemy, and they have to be defeated and destroyed. And the difference between far right and far left is a question of identifying who that enemy are. Although even then you sometimes see an alignment of agreement and understanding, but also what the enemy's tactics and strategy are, and therefore what your tactics and strategy should be. So I use the label far right, but I realise there are challenges with it. Now, what about fascism and Nazism? I think people would struggle with the word Nazi and Nazism because that's particularly identified with anti-Semitism. And what we're seeing with the kind of the ethno-cultural nationalism movement at the moment is a keenness to say we are not anti-Semitic. Fascism perhaps has less of that, but there may be an element of that in terms of how the word is being used, its identity with that. But I think we tend to identify fascism with authoritarianism. You look at the dictionary definitions and they'll talk about the idea of authoritarian leadership, often focused in one strong leader. So Mussolini, Hitler. There'd be other examples throughout history in different countries. The attempt by Otto Mosley to do something similar here in the war with his new party and the black shirts. Now, that has been debated in terms of what we've seen in this recent movement, because I think what people are saying is, well, hold on, here's two things. One, this seems to be a reaction against the perceived authoritarianism. And two, it's about freedom of speech. So how can it be authoritarian? And then I guess the third one would be there isn't, although you may have frontmen like Tommy Robinson but there isn't necessarily, here is the one kind of the leader, the Führer, the Uber leader. A couple of things to say about that. First, it's easy to talk about freedom of speech when what we mean is our own freedom, when we're protecting our right, our freedom to say what we want, to put our beliefs forward, even if other people consider them offensive or dangerous. It is another to say that I am concerned to protect the freedom of others to believe and to say and to do what they do what they want without interference. So, for example, it is just incompatible to say that we are here on a rally to protect freedom of expression and then to say we want mosques banned. I remember a good number of years ago, I was living down south. Our church was next to the high street in our town, and just a couple of doors down, a shop opened up with all kinds of pagan and witchcraft type stuff. And there were people in the church that said, should we be protesting against that? Should we be trying to stop it open? And I remember the pastor saying, no. We are grieved by those things. We don't want people to be ensnared by them, but trying to get them banned is not the way that we deal with that, because actually then those that come for their freedom will come for ours next. So I'm not convinced that this is about freedom. Not really about freedom. It's about specific people's freedom, about the freedom to express specific views and do specific things, and therefore it is about those views and those things. Secondly, you can only really properly see authoritarianism when you see it actually in a place where it's got power. I'm going to be honest and say what I've seen, what I've observed in terms of interactions is that there is a kind of authoritarianism in terms of how people interact. I've been told that I've got no right and no permission to speak on issues. I've experienced that attempt online for people to silence me, to say, you have no right to speak, you must be silent. I think the reliance on marches, I'm not a big fan of them anyway, and the attempt to inflate numbers is an attempt to use power, the sheer power of numbers, to enforce your will and to get your way. And whilst we may not see a definite single Uber leader, I think we have seen the way that people have presented themselves. We've seen people that are certainly putting themselves forward for that position, not by democratic election, but by some form of acclamation. And so, in some sense, I'm relaxed about what we call this in the end, providing we get what is going on. But I would encourage you, if you're trying to work that out, to just think through those things. Now, what I am arguing is that this stuff is idolatrous. It takes us to a false God and a false gospel, a different gospel. And I'm going to talk a bit more about idolatry in our third video. So thanks for watching in.